Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on comparing the cost of ownership between Dynamics AX and Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. My name is Sabrina. I'm on the marketing team here at Stoneridge Software. I'm joined by Scott, who is our presenter today, and Ron and Amanda, who will be here to answer any questions that we may have at the end as well. We're going to have about 15 minutes of content here, and then we'll have 15 minutes to answer any questions that you do have. Everyone is currently muted, so when those questions come to mind, go ahead and put those in the questions pane. And after the presentation in about 15 minutes, we'll go ahead and I can pass those questions along to Scott, Amanda, and Ron. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Scott.
Awesome. Thank you, Sabrina. Welcome, everyone, to our Wednesday webinar. It's been awesome to be able to go through and do a couple of these so far, so it's a pleasure to be speaking with you guys again today. Obviously, we are covering the comparing cost of ownership between AX and D365 FinOps is the main topic here. The intent of this webinar is to give you as much information as possible, obviously within 15 minutes. But what we've noticed is that having the feedback from you as part of this discussion, I think answers the more tactical questions that you may have, that instead of us just telling you how it is, sometimes you have questions that are a little bit deeper as well. So we look forward to those questions as we go through this process. So topic-wise that we're going to be covering for the agenda, we've got pretty much three core areas, and we've got an infographic that we're going to be using that kind of leads us along with this, is to really understand what are the differences in the licensing costs that we have between AX and D365, and how does that relate then to the software? Because I've heard many different things from prospects and customers in terms of the feedback with those licensing costs. And then past that, what's the infrastructure and IT resource costs that we need to be able to look at with this? Because there's obviously a shift with this in a cloud model that we need to understand, and that you can benefit from, obviously, as part of that cost shift. And potentially even some resource shifting in terms of what resources do within your organization. And then the final portion of this obviously is talking about those training cost aspects. Training obviously has some aspects that are harder when you go to a new system or you go to a new user interface, like we're seeing with finance and operations, but there are also tools that help you with that as part of that process. So the very first topic here, licensing, and this is our infographic that we've been sharing, and we'll have links to this at the end as well. As you can see, no two icebergs are the same, but you can see in here that the point that we're trying to get across with this is that when you're looking at what those costs of ownership are going to be for licensing, there's a lot more that you do not see as part of that when you actually go through your implementation of the actual product, and even the maintenance of it as well. And what we're highlighting here is that while cloud may be more expensive for licensing, there's also other aspects of the cloud that are not covered, obviously, within on-premise. So to kind of talk to that, here's the comparing of licensing that we have with it. So the very first thing that we need to know is that we've got a new licensing model. Obviously, it's called subscription licensing. If you haven't read up on it, you should. The licensing itself, if you do like a cost comparison and you take it out for 4 years, one of the biggest feedback items I've seen is that everyone says, well, it's way more expensive than having a perpetual license or buying the software up front for $4,000 a user and then deploying it. But what they don't understand is the fact that that hardware and infrastructure cost is folded into that cloud license cost. And so when you're looking at it, know that your licensing cost, you can't compare it in an apples to apples perspective with that, because there is differences on the infrastructure and resource requirements that you have in your organization. There's also the aspect that licensing is actually applied towards more than one product too. So when you start looking at some of the licensing, you can buy each individual product if you want to, but you can also get enterprise licensing that allows for you then to use D365 FinOps or Finance and Operations, or Dynamics 365 for sales. We use a lot of different acronyms here, as you can tell. But the net result is that that can actually drive then some additional value for you as part of that licensing. And then lastly, obviously, you can pay for what you need. That's a big thing. There are some agreements that you can have with Microsoft Microsoft, like with enterprise agreements, that don't allow you to do that, but there are others. There's something called Cloud CSP that Ron can probably talk to a little bit, but it allows you to adapt to your business in terms of those user counts very easily and effectively. So those are some of the major differences that are there. Ron, I didn't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add to this.
Sure. No, I think one of the things to really think about when you're looking at this, many of you may or may not be on what's called an enterprise agreement. And an enterprise agreement with Microsoft is essentially you're paying for licenses typically upfront for a period monthly, but for a period of anywhere from 1 to 3 years. There's typically a monetary or there is some value there in terms of the licensing, because often if you're on an EA that's a volume agreement, you're going to probably find the prices to be a bit less than in what we call a CSP model. The value of a CSP model, while it might be a little bit more per seat, the value is that you can actually upgrade or downgrade those licenses. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well, about how you can go from a more expensive license down to a more affordable license based on what those roles are.
Awesome. So just something to know, when you're looking at the licensing, start thinking about other options that you have now with other products and those other costs that maybe you should be looking at as part of the comparison. The hardware cost that you have, the resource utilization cost, all those should be compared as part of that for the maintenance of the actual system. So the other area that we look at then with this, obviously, as we're digging into this, is going to be the infrastructure and resource costs that we have, the actual hardware that we're maintaining, that we have to upgrade, that all of a sudden we have to have a major increase in hardware because we didn't scale it correctly, potentially, as an example, the patches, the maintenance, the upgrades. Those are all aspects as well that need to be considered with this. And as you can see, I try to highlight here, those are in the licensing now as well. The infrastructure is Azure, the maintenance is maintained by Microsoft, so patches and updates to the actual server platform are being maintained. And then also, if you think about it, because you're not then maintaining that specific hardware on site, you don't have that server rack and all that infrastructure, those roles that you have internally that are maintaining that can be potentially tasked with other support roles inside of your organization. And I just want to highlight that is that we're not looking at, some companies love to talk about headcount reduction. I am totally, against that, and saying that people can be realigned potentially to be able to assist with the business to help them from a more supportive role moving forward potentially. And then lastly as well, from an infrastructure perspective, let's say you wanted to do a disaster recovery site. Let's say that you wanted to spin up a larger instance of FinOps to help with some scalability because maybe you had a hot product that came out and all of a sudden you've got just tons of orders that are coming in. With Azure and with the infrastructure, you can just scale it up obviously as part of that. But from your perspective inside of AX, especially when it's on-prem, you've got to buy all that new hardware with it. So remember that those infrastructure and resource costs should be considered as part of your comparison between AX and D365 from the licensing perspective as well.
I think the other thing to add to that to be thinking about is when you have this infrastructure available to you through Azure, it also gives you the ability to be able to really leverage some of those Power Apps, in particular Power BI. When you think about the amount of data that's out there that can be consumed and brought in for you to use in terms of determining, making decisions, that you might want as an organization moving forward, the Azure servers and the data centers can be powered up. You can leverage more horsepower in a matter of seconds to be able to support that amount of data that you wouldn't have been able to do with your own in-house servers in the past. So there's a lot of advantages there as well.
Yep, absolutely. So just something to note, and we're trying to highlight the cost comparisons for you that are actually as many real world examples as possible as part of this. And then finally, obviously, the training cost. I mean, I have heard many different stories from an AX 2009 to an AX 2012 upgrade, and the pain and understanding and relearning a role center and all those different concepts that are in there without having really good tools to help you through that process. So from the training perspective, I mean, you hear this every time, and I know, but I just want to argue a little bit towards it and say, hey, wait a second. When I started using Dynamics 365, I was happy that I was actually able to interact in a modern user interface for the time, because all the other software applications that we have are generally updating, right? Our phones are updating all the time, and the user interfaces are reflecting the feedback of the generation. And so from my perspective, and from what I've seen from other customers as well, is that modern type of look and feel makes it easier for people to understand, because it aligns then towards what that expectation is of software for that generation. You go back 30 years ago and you had green screens, people were happy with that. They were able to use it for those job processes. But if you did that now, it would not be conducive to business for you long term. So just something to note with that. The other aspect of this is that you can actually access the actual application from anywhere now. As long as you have internet access, you can access that information. So people can actually set up training environments that people can access externally, so that way you can ramp up your actual internal subject matter experts much easier and faster. And then there's also a couple of new tools that have been added to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. We've had the task recorder in prior versions, but we haven't had a task recorder that guides us step by step in a process on how to actually do the creation of a new warehouse or the creation of a sales order in the system. So that's a very powerful feature that really helps prospects and customers understand then when they're doing a new rollout or an upgrade, that they can actually do this process using this specific task recording. And then the other big thing I just want to highlight here, a lot of ERP systems, if you want to go online and look up SAP documentation, have fun trying to find it. You have to pay for SAP for that documentation, or Oracle, or a lot of the other players that are out there. But as you've noticed, probably with TechNet and with all the documentation that's available for Dynamics 365, it's publicly available. If I have a question on a particular process in projects, for example, I can click on it to get to that information, and it's reflective then of the current modern user interface that we're using. So that online documentation that Microsoft is maintaining, while it may not be just a one-click experience to get to it, is a very powerful tool that you can use to stay current and then also help train your people on how to use functionality inside of the application. So that was, I think we're getting to time right here. Ron, I don't know if you had anything else with training costs that you wanted to add to that as well.
No, I think the biggest point in here is that task recorder. That's one of the things that we've witnessed when demonstrating the software to companies that are entertaining the idea of either upgrading or looking at the FinOps software as a net new solution, is that that seems to have the biggest wow factor. And the reason why it's a wow factor is because it really gives the end user the opportunity to be able to go back without having to rely on documentation, without having to rely on your memory, and go through and run those tasks, go through those processes, and do them in the order that's been configured for your organization, not necessarily, as an out-of-the-box type of recorder, although there are many of them. You can actually create these recordings that would be specific to what the processes are for your particular organization, and use those for new employees when they come in, or just as refreshers for those that are maybe going through and doing a year-end close. Those processes aren't done that frequently, so it's really a valuable tool.
Yep, absolutely. So at this point, we've got another 15 minutes. We figured we'd open up the floor for you guys. If you have any more specific questions about the comparisons between the products in terms of that licensing cost or any of the costs involved, we've got a team here ready to answer any of your questions. So shoot away, please.
We did have one question come in from Daniel so far. He's currently on AXR3, and they're looking to upgrade to finance and operations in the cloud. And when they talked to their partner said that their annual cost for their IT budget will double or triple. And it sounds like, obviously we're saying that this could be more cost effective. And would there be a reason, I guess, why their partner says that their IT budget's going to go up so much?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll take the first stab at it. So, as I was saying before, that licensing cost with it, what a lot of people are doing is they look at an ERP system and they look at how they've upgraded in the past. So they say every 3 years they're going to go through and do an upgrade as part of that, or as part of that actual implementation, so to speak. And if you buy the actual licensing up front, and it's $4,000 a user, and let's say it's 200 users or something in that range. And then you compare that for 3 years with a subscription license. And then you also include, your maintenance and all that. You'll notice after 2 or 3 years that the cost of actually maintaining finance and operations, the online version, is more expensive, because if you don't upgrade after 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, at 5 years, then you've got 2 years of licensing that you've paid potentially for finance and operations that you may have not paid with your other ERP system. So that's the very common example that I've seen, and I've even initially I argued that fact too. It might just be partner-wise, there's probably more details with it, so we'd want to get those details. But the net result is that when you start looking at then the infrastructure, you start looking at the upgrade and the transparency of the upgrades that are there as well. Cost-wise, after calculating out if you did an upgrade at the same schedule and introduced the same amount of features inside of the ERP system as they're doing with finance and operations on AX 2012, I think you're going to see a very different picture. I think that you're going to see more expensive aspects in terms of that upgrade, because remember, that licensing cost that you're paying for your maintenance is just the licensing. It's not the infrastructure. It's not the upgrades, because remember, Microsoft is getting to an auto update cycle with ERP for their upgrades as well. So those aspects I think really need to be considered with it. And I think we'd want to get some more detail from you on it to really understand what that is, to help you make an informed decision at that point. The net result is most people that are going with D365 do see a total overall reduction in costs that they have over an extended period of time when comparing upgrades, life cycle of upgrades, features being added, and things of that nature compared to the prior platform. Now, Ron, did you have anything else, or Amanda too?
No, I think, Scott, you really hit it home there on the idea of that the subscription license really does include all of the infrastructure that you're going to need, plus the added security that you're going to get with the application in terms of firewall protection. I think one of the things that people oftentimes have difficulty really kind of getting their heads around is, there's oftentimes the belief that if the data is not sitting in my closet somewhere, it's, and it's out on a cloud, it's vulnerable. If you really look at the Azure security, and I would encourage anyone to do that, there's a lot of content out there. They really go into all the different levels of security that's available to the customer. I don't think anybody could really match with an on-premise solution. So there's a lot of value there. But again, on the surface, when you compare the two licenses, I think first glance it does look like, well, it's going to cost us a lot more. But at the end of the day, the way you explained it with the rest of the upgrade capabilities that you don't have to be performing down the road, a lot of that really comes into play, and you see that as a big win.
Great, thanks you guys. Question from Jeff here. You mentioned scaling up the D365 environment when needed. Please clarify if that is a real-time adjustment similar to scaling up resources in Azure, or if it takes Microsoft support involvement.
That's a really good question. I do not know that one off the top of my head. I would have to follow up with it. I know for a fact that they have scaling measurements that are put into the actual instances themselves. And there are a couple of aspects here too. There's Microsoft has a couple of different tiers for how you actually support the actual D365 FinOps environment. There's what they call Tier 1, which is Microsoft Manage, which means that they have all the metrics and KPIs and they're maintaining the Azure machine. There's also different tiers that have the actual instance on your Azure instance. So those are other aspects too that need to be considered. But we can definitely follow up with you to find out whether or not it's actually a Microsoft managed, so to speak, where you have to open a support ticket, or if it's automated based off of transactional volume. I know for a fact that they talked about making it so that it was based off of transactional volume at one point. I just don't know if that has been RTM'd or released yet at this point on the platform.
All right, we have a question from Brian. What Azure resources are included? If I want a separate SQL instance for reporting, would that be included or would that be extra? And what about the dev, the test, AX instances or environment? Is it extra for each environment? And are there backup costs?
Well, from anytime you go to the subscription model with FinOps, you're going to get 3 instances immediately. You're going to get your production, your development, and then a test. So you get those automatically. You can also purchase additional instances, which oftentimes our clients will do for UAT production or builds beyond development, but then they'll shut those off often once they've gone live. So there's a couple of different ways to slice it, but you will get 3 instances right out of the chute.
All right, a question from Mike here. We have a number of other systems integrated with our AX 2012 system. We're looking to upgrade to D365. With this in mind, would it be better for us to stay on-prem with our upgrade or go to the cloud version knowing we are going to have to redo the integrations?
Yeah, the dreaded integration question, right? I can understand because the integrations that you're probably doing right now may or may not use the older web services, obviously, or maybe even just direct SQL inserts, right? Because you did have that control, and with the cloud model, obviously you don't. I have a this is an opinion. This is my opinion, and I don't know if it's shared by the team, but I'll just broadcast it. I think the on-prem solution for D365 F&O is potentially a long-term, maybe an okay solution to have, but the actual push that Microsoft has is so much in the cloud right now. And it always feels like now, it used to be cloud was an afterthought. If you go back 7 years ago or even 8 years ago, when we were selling or talking with our prospects and actual clients, we would actually be talking about on-prem because no one would ever imagine replacing ERP in the cloud because of connectivity and all these other issues that have over time kind of gone away or have been reduced. I shouldn't say go away. The net result is that if it were me, I would look at the cloud enablement portion of this and look at the rewriting of those integrations, because that is what Microsoft is continually updating. That is what was first launched for D365. It feels like now the on-prem solution that they have is an afterthought. And to be honest with you, any new prospect that we talk with on the finance and operations side, we are always talking about cloud. We have not, to my knowledge, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, sold an on-premise version of finance and operations, and that's partially because of the hardware requirements that it has for the on-prem version. It's pretty hefty compared to even AX 2012 R3.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very hefty. One of the other things that we always attempt to do with our clients, and before we'd ever encourage anybody to make the transition to the cloud, we're always going to do some type of assessment on those integrations. Often it's just one of the components or one of the parts of what we call an enterprise process review. But that integration assessment is really critical. We want to understand, when I say we, collectively, us and our client, we really want to understand what those integrations are going to look like before we start jumping into the cloud. So we'll really take a very prudent look at that, so that you know, we're strategic in that effort and we know what needs to be done before we jump into it.
Yeah, because there are tactics that we can do, like maybe there's something, a hybrid approach, right, where you're on cloud,
Exactly.
but the integration portion, we've got something managing that potentially that's on-prem, for example. So that's a really good point, Ron. Thank you.
Yep.
We have another question here from Muhammad. For updates down the road, do I need to buy any SIT instance, or is it included in the subscription?
No, updates to the product are included in the subscription and provided by Microsoft. There's no additional licensing for that.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, just to be really frank, I mean, so your system integration testing that you're looking at with SIT, you know, you've got the 3 environments. If you'd like to add more environments where you want to separate UAT from SIT, you could do that. We see a lot of our actual prospects and customers using the same system for both as
Yep.
part of that. So just
Yep.
something to note is the bigger you are, you know, obviously you may want to start separating those, but there may be a cost then with that UAT versus SIT that you use.
Right. It's really up to, it's customer preference, and if they choose, there are, you know, again, you're going to get 3 instances right out of the chute, but you can always add additional instances, and you can use that for a short period of time or long term, whatever your preference is.
Right now, those are all the questions that have come in. We have a couple more minutes here if anybody else has any questions they'd like to have answered today.
If there's no other questions, one of the things I'll throw out there too is, if you are giving some consideration to doing an upgrade to D365, I would encourage you to speak to your partner about that soon, because there are going, at this point, there still are some discounts available to those customers that are on a current version. And when I say current version of AX or NAV or whatever it might be, current meaning that they have they're stayed current on their support agreement with Microsoft, there's discount opportunities for you through, I believe, the November of this year, but we'd have to confirm that. But this will be the last year that they'll be offering discounts for those people that are looking to migrate. So I would, again, just reiterate, speak to your partner about that, because I think there might be some value if you're looking at doing it this year.
Great. We did have one more question come in here. What are the typical D365 FinOps cloud / network reliability metrics? And does my business shut down if I have an internet or Azure outage?
Awesome question.
Really?
It is probably, yeah, it is the most common one I will get as a pre-sales architect going out on site. When I do my demonstrations, I usually use a mobile hotspot. And I do it intentionally. And the reason for it is to show, in case, you know, we have a disaster where we have our main pipe go down, what are the options that we have for resiliency? Because you are absolutely right. If you are used to having your on-prem solution inside of your business and you lose internet connectivity, you can still run the business. And for manufacturers and distributors, that's huge. Now, this is a problem that was before cloud as well. So if you start looking at like an ASP model where you're hosting your servers on a different location, well, if your pipe goes down between your location and that ASP, you're going to have the same type of issues. So you have to have redundancy built in to your actual infrastructure setup. So, you know, it depends. It really does. If you're out in the middle of, we'll say South Dakota, and you don't have reliable internet connectivity, I think that there should be some conversations then around potentially on-prem at that point. Because if you still want to upgrade and use the modern user interface and then use all the new technologies that are there, well then, you know, obviously you want to make sure that, you know, you can actually use that without having connectivity issues. I don't know if there are any metrics specifically on connectivity that Microsoft releases, we can definitely look for that, get you some information. But the net result is that, like I said, I do it on hotspots. Make sure you have your infrastructure set up where you do have redundancy, and at locations that do not have redundant capabilities, I think there's further exploration that needs to be done to figure out whether or not, you know, there is an option via satellite, via mobile, you know, 3G, 4G, whatever it is, to be able to support it in that particular location.
Thanks, Scott. I don't have any other new questions that have come in, but I just wanted to mention on this screen that Scott pulled up, we do have a lot of resources if you're considering upgrading from AX to D365. So I'll send out this slide deck after today's webinar, but check out those sites and check out our blog. And we do have a lot of other upcoming events and webinars where we're going to talk about different topics related to upgrading, including support lifecycle, mobile capabilities, new features, and you'll be able to ask questions that you have at that time as well. Seeing no more questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up for today. But if you think of any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to answer those at any time. Thanks, Scott and Ron and Amanda.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you too.